What we're about to do is the reason why we moved from using just standard functions to using a class. Because now that we have this user manager stuff, we can actually use our data class a little bit more robustly when we're trying to message this user, at least form the message for this user. And to do this, we are going to come in here and I'm going to add a couple new arguments, and I'll say user ID equals to none and email also equals to none. And we're going to get the user data by just simply saying user equals to self.get user data, and then user ID equals to none and email equals to none. So, or excuse me, email user ID equals to user ID and email equals to user ID. So what we're passing through here will also be passed through here, and it's going to go through with the function that's related to the class, right? It's going directly in it. So now we can just say if user, then we will actually run through all of that stuff. And I'm saying if user only because down here we can actually see that user can return none or some sort of string. So what I also want to do is down here is I don't actually want to return these strings anymore. I'll just print out if they are not found. And that's pretty much it. The reason I don't want to return those at all is because the string being returned will also assume that this is no longer none, and then a lot of this stuff might break. But what you might realize is this get user data is going to be a dictionary. So it's actually going to come back as a dictionary. So we can actually use the user as context. Very cool, very easy, and pretty straightforward. So let's go back into our main Py file and add in the user ID stuff. I'm going to go ahead and paste this in here. We'll save it, and let's go ahead and run message first without anything on it. And we get none. Right? It's not sending a message. Why is that? Because we don't have an ID. So I add ID in there, and then I get this formatting error. But I do see that this is what's necessary to actually do it. Just like the get user data, we actually have to pass the ID or email in there so we can actually see something. And now we got this error that's happening. So let's actually take a look at this error and read it line by line. Now these first lines is basically just saying, hey, in run main module thing, we've got some error in here. We don't see any of this stuff. Like, that's not that relevant. But now it's saying file main line 18, which is right here, is causing this error. So in that module, we are seeing this stuff, and then it shows us the next file, data class line 23 in message user, render context. So let's go and take a look at that. Data class 23, render context. So it's actually showing us that. And then it goes this one step further in utils.template, because render context, of course, is being imported from utils.templates. So we go in there and we look at the line. It says line 17, and it says line 17 right here. And here's actually where the error is happening. So that gives us a really good trace back as to where the error is happening. But then it says key error total. Now, I already know what this error is, and hopefully you remember back to when we ran some of this stuff that we did run into some errors, but the error has to do with the template itself. This is one of the limitations to the method that we're using, but it is something that I know, so we can fix it real quick, and it's a good opportunity to actually talk about it. So the key error is these right here. So these things are going to be formatted out, right? So if I type out amount, this will now work, and I'll show why in just a second. But total didn't work because our data in our database, which is what our dictionary ends up turning into, has amount as the primary header there. It does not have the total, right? It said total, but now it says amount. So just slightly different into what we've been learning so far, or at least what we've been working with. Just little naming things that sometimes can mess up your entire program. But in this case, we're going step by step, so we catch it early on. So I can go ahead and close all that stuff out, save it, and now let's go back into terminal and press up. And now I see that I have newly rendered out documents. It says, hey Justin, total 231. Of course, if we look back at that database, we'd be able to see it. Both of these things are now working just fine. Cool. So now that we can actually render this context, there's one more step, of course, that we will still need to take, and that is message user should actually be a little bit different than this, and it should not actually render our templates. What it should do instead is send a message to this user, or send an email to this user. So let's go ahead and bring this one level out, and we're going to make another method in here. So I'll define it as, we'll call this render template, or let's say instead render message, and we'll say self and user. So I'll call it user data to go along with what we called it down here, user data. So user self and user data. So notice user data is required. And then I'm just going to go ahead and copy this stuff right here. All right. So we've got our data. User data is now going to be the context. We, of course, can get rid of that completely, but having context in there as a variable will help anybody else understand what's going on with this. Context is just kind of one of those things that you'll use quite a bit in the future. But since the user data is a dictionary, then we can actually go ahead and claim it as such. So I could also say if is instance user data and dict, then do these things. This is just a double check to make sure that we don't have any issues when it comes to running. And this should say is instance. There we go. And finally, we're going to return both of these actual rendered context. So I'm going to say plain underscore, as in plain text, is equal to this render context. And then HTML is equal to this render context. Okay. So now that we've got that, we're going to go ahead and return plain and HTML. I'm using the little underscore just to make sure that it is known as a variable. That's just another way to do that. And if it's not an instance, we're going to return a tuple or tuple of none. And we don't return twice. Okay, so now we've got our render message working, so I can actually go ahead and get rid of all of this and just say the plain text and the HTML text is equal to self.renderMessage of the user. Right? So the user, of course, is that variable. Self-renderMessage is all this. And now I've got that stuff, so we can definitely print those things out again. So we might as well. I'm going to go ahead and print plain and HTML. So we'll see those in just a second. But now we have a great opportunity to send this as a actual email. So going back into some of the stuff we did before, going into old source, we have our hungry data, message users, I believe is going to be the one that it is. This looks like it. So let's go ahead and open that up. And we've got our email stuff here, as well as we have our send email message here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out the main part of this, which is this try block here. But I'm also going to keep that SMTP exception in here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the entire try block. And we're going to bring it back into our data class. I'm going to put it up above our class for now, just to organize our data and our thoughts. I do this all the time. Okay, so I've got that organized. And I'm also going to go ahead and do all the imports that we have here as well. And make sure I have them in this also. Paste this in here, and it looks like we already have date and time, or date time imported, so we don't have to import that again. All right, so now we've got a few things here set up for actually sending our email. I'm not going to worry about the SMTP exception just yet. I want to make sure I can get everything else going. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this again and paste it inside of this if user call. And I'll explain what's going on here in just a second, but we'll tab this in. And we've got our plain text now. So our plain text is going to be our part 1 plain text. And then our HTML text is going to be our part 2, which is actually not showing up here. So let's go ahead and look at our other code that we already created for that. Inside of old source, we have HTML format email. So let's open that one up. And this is the part 1, part 2 stuff that we're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that and come back in here, paste it in. Notice it's really not a whole lot different. And we could have just intuitively did it anyway. But I'm going to go ahead and now just go ahead and get rid of this and that. There we go. So now we have part 1, part 2. We have the message, so on and so forth. So plain text, HTML text. Okay. So now all of this stuff is looking good. And then we have our send, from, to, and message. Okay, so let's stop for a second and think about all of the things that we just did. I'm going to get rid of this one. We need a to list, which we have up here. So it's going directly to that user right there. So the to list, we might want to add the actual user email. So user email we don't have. From email, I believe we also set up here. We do. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this try block so we can see all those settings a little bit easier. So we've got our from email, to email, and then the message. So all of this stuff should work, assuming that all of these credentials are done correctly. They might not be, but we will test this out in just a second. So we've got our email connection starting. We're logging in. We're doing our email stuff. We've already rendered the templates, right? So we already rendered the templates out right here. So that's what that's doing. And then we've got our messages, and then we'll actually send that message from the email, and then our to list, which is up above. So we can actually set the user email. So I actually do want to get the user email, and that's going to be equal to user.get email. And if it's not an email, I'll just say hello@teamcfe.com. I think that's the one. Nope, we have it on. So basically it's saying get the user email if it's in that dictionary. Otherwise, use hello@teamcfe.com. And then our to list, we are going to add this to it. So I'm going to say to list equals to list.append. Or actually, we don't need to do that. We just do to list.append and user email. And now put that to list in there. This should actually send it out. So now that we've got all that stuff rendered out, let's go ahead and try this again. We'll actually message the user and see if it works. I'm going to press up once, press enter, and we've got an SMTP exception error. That's okay. I know exactly why, and that's because my password is incorrect. So going back in here, I believe the password is this now. Of course, by the time you see it, it's not going to be that, but let's try it again. I'll press enter, and no errors. Email has sent. Let's jump into that email address, go into and there we go. We've got billing update. Hey Justin, total 321. This is a testing email message made by CFE, right? So there's the date, and that date should correlate to that user's ID. So let's go ahead and jump into our mock database here. We got user 1, right? So we've got our date here, and let's look at it. And I'm just going to put it in here as reply, and we've got that actual thing in there. So 18, 21, so on. Okay, great. So notice this is being sent to Hungry, but the actual email that it was sent to is hello@teamcfe, and that should make sense because that's the user that we used. And if we look back at our actual data class, we see that we set that user in this part right here, whereas this to list will just send it to any of them. And in this case, we see that it's a BCC. So it actually BCC'd me by adding the to list in this function. So if I didn't have it or if it's empty, it should still send the email out just fine. Okay, cool. So we now have a more functional way to actually send out these messages to users. This is actually pretty good as far as what you would need to do. Of course, from here, you can still update like the sent message. You could say this is true, and you could put a bunch of if clauses in here saying whether or not it is true. But there is one more thing that I wanted to add, and that's that try block. So let's go ahead and do that. Try and the exception for this particular email, mainly because we don't want it to mess up if for whatever reason it does. Go ahead and tab this in, put that exception, and we'll just say error sending message. Cool. And of course you could change the subject, or you can make the subject inside of the message. Actually, let's go ahead and just do that. I'm going to come up here and put subject equals to and billing update, and come back down here and put it as subject. So the default now is billing update. So yeah, that is it. We have now created a very simple way to message any particular user in our database that has this. And of course, you could make a function. So I'm not going to do this, but I want to challenge you guys to do this. Can you update this data class to iterate through every item in here. And after that item is iterated through, check whether or not it's been sent. So you're going to have to update these values, whether or not it's been sent once you send it. And then I want you to be able to actually send it. So you should have enough skill by now to actually do that. Like I said, I'm going to leave it here. If somebody comes up with the answer, actually the first person to come up with the answer, please send me a message because I will actually give you something. I'm not going to tell you what, but I will give you something. The very first person to do that, successfully do it, sends it to me. I'm not going to help you find the answer, but the first person to actually do that will definitely get something pretty cool. Anyway, so thanks so much for watching, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this part so far. Of course, this is the end of day 20. Now what we're going to be doing is a lot more stuff in Python, but now you could hopefully really recognize how valuable this could be if you could start really using this for your own business or just sending messages to friends. You can have like a kind of a preset message to all your friends on a regular interval, and all kinds of cool things that you could just kind of think about doing when it comes to actually building your functioning programs. The next thing that I would say is now hopefully you will also gain a new appreciation for something like Django, because all of this stuff that I went through, Django already has versions of it in very similar formats, but not exactly the same. But their send mail function is very similar to this, as well as their get template and render context. All of those sort of things are actually already built into Django, which gives it just one more added benefit of using, where you don't even have to use it as a web framework, but you can at least use it because it has a lot of convenient methods versus writing your own like we did here. So thanks again for watching days 1 through 20. Days 21 to 30, we're going to be doing some more stuff inside of Python to really bring your skills to the next level. Hope to see you guys tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching.